This is not the way to protest. And just because this one group says, well, we want this, well, that's great. That's great. You're making it difficult for everyone to actually exercise their civic duty, and you think it's a big joke, and you think it's funny. Well, democracy shouldn't be a joke. It's no secret that Pierre Poilievre is set to run in a by-election in Ballot river-crowfoot in order to regain a seat so that he can perform his role as the leader of the official opposition in the House of Commons in Parliament. Unfortunately, the organization intent on making a complete mockery of our electoral process, also known as the Longest Ballot Committee, seems intent on making it more difficult than ever for Canadians to actually cast their ballot. This has infuriated Canadians across the country, but what many people don't know is that Elections Canada is just as ticked off about this as the rest of us, to the point of even begging the Liberals to change the law. Let's take a look.
Madam Speaker, I would.
For most of the last 90 years, Eastern Alberta has been represented in the House of Commons by a member of Parliament with conservative values. Now known as Battle River-Crowfoot, it's Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre's intent to run in the riding to secure a seat in Ottawa.
Having the leaders as your area is obviously an advantage, but...
Last week, MP Damien Keurig pledged to step aside to allow Poilievre to run for his seat. The party leader lost his seat in Ottawa in the recent federal election, but in Battle River-Crowfoot, Keurig claimed 82% of the votes.
At the end of the day, it's really about we are a conservative area and just making sure we have representative, and having the leader represent us, not a bad thing. But again, I'm very proud of the work Damien's done with this, and we've been blessed to have him.
The Longest Ballot Committee plans to put forward dozens of candidates for the vote, just as they did in Poilievre's Carleton riding last month.
It's clearly intended as a protest to try to put pressure on government to change the electoral process, to have something like proportional representation or perhaps even a ranked ballot.
A statement from the Longest Ballot Committee to Global News confirms the plan, saying they've had feedback from both sides, some delightfully positive, others vitriolically upset. But the committee says it's frustrated with the current rules governing elections and wants to send a message.
So they may want to send a message, but here's the problem with protesting, right? If you're impacting people that, aren't really having anything to do with the protest itself, then something is a little off about that. So you take the group Just Stop Oil, and if you haven't seen the group Just Stop Oil, be prepared to have a whole bunch of face palms if you end up looking them up. They are one of the most ridiculous anti-oil and gas group ever, because they literally want to shut down highways. They want to just stand in front of people's cars, stop buses from moving in protest of oil. This is the problem, because it's not the average, consumer that is the issue here. They should be protesting, at the sites of the oil and gas producers if they really want to protest. Don't Just Stop Oil. Just like when it comes to this, the Longest Ballot Committee is making it so difficult for Canadians to vote, even though Canadians aren't the ones that have anything to do with this. So they're not standing out in front of Parliament Hill, which is, the hard part to do. All they're doing is signing a bunch of names on a ballot and then they're voting for themselves and then laughing about it. This is the most ridiculous thing about this whole organization. Their protest isn't even a protest in the classic sense of the word. It's just ticking people off and making it difficult to vote. And it's going to get even harder this time. Protest group hoping to add 200 plus names to Pierre Poilievre's Alberta by-election ballot. A protest group that signed up dozens of candidates to run in Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's riding in the past federal election is planning to bring their campaign to an upcoming Alberta by-election. The Longest Ballot Committee is working to see if it can find 200 people interested in adding their names to the ballot in the upcoming Battle River-Crowfoot by-election. The group was responsible for adding 85 names to the ballot for Carleton, Pierre Poilievre's former riding, for a total of 91 candidates running in the federal election. In an email to supporters, the Longest Ballot Committee said it has received, quote, dozens and dozens of emails from people asking to join the ballot, end quote, for the upcoming by-election. Quote, given the outpouring of interest, we will do our best to make a long ballot happen if we get at least 200 people signing up to be candidates, end quote, the group said. The Conservative Party announced Friday that Damien Carrick, the MP for Battle River-Crowfoot, intended to resign his seat to allow Poilievre to run in a by-election to regain a seat in the House of Commons. Now, here's the issue, folks. If you recall voting in the federal election, in most ridings, you were given, like a small ballot that would, fold, over in three sections. You took it back to the screen. You selected who you wanted to. You folded it over, and then you went up and slotted it into the actual box. The problem with these ballots is they are over a meter long, and these are like just the recent ones. They're over a meter long, and you have to fold it up in many different sections in order to actually put it into the ballot. The other issue is that from an accessibility point of view, people who have difficulty reading, people who have challenges with their eyesight, people who have challenges with their hands, people who may get confused easily, some people even with learning disabilities, depending on how that affects them when it comes to literacy. It creates a massive problem for them because they're not just looking at 4 or 5 names, they're looking at dozens, and in some cases almost 100. Now they want to add this to 200. Well, this becomes even more of a problem for these people because the chief electoral officer is going to have to get creative in order to fit these names on this ballot. Now, the chief electoral officer of Canada isn't happy with this either. A lot of people have said, well, why do they allow this? The problem is Elections Canada, by law, cannot prevent it. That's the issue. There used to be a barrier to running in a federal election up until 2017, and that barrier was you had to pay $1,000. Well, in 2017, as we mentioned before on our previous live stream, you don't have to do that anymore. One of the federal courts actually reviewed a case and struck down the $1,000 bond that you had to pay because they said it was against the Charter of Rights. Running in the election should be open and fair and accessible to anyone. So they said no $1,000. So anyone can run. You just need somebody to basically sign them up. Pretty easy. So this is the problem here. Now, it's also not new that the Chief Electoral Officer and Elections Canada have been ticked off by this because they actually wrote a letter to Dominic LeBlanc way back in September of 2024 after the debacle at the Toronto St. Paul's by-election. Here's a letter from the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada to Dominic LeBlanc. Dear Minister LeBlanc, on September 16, 2024, electors voted in the electoral district of LaSalle-Emard-Verdun using a ballot featuring 91 confirmed candidates, and that required modifications in terms of size, font, and design. The large number of candidates continues a trend that began during the 44th general election and has continued through 4 successive by-elections through 2022, 2023, and 2024 as part of a protest movement known as the Longest Ballot Committee. Each of these elections featured significantly more candidates than is the norm in Canada's federal elections. Most of the large number of candidates in these elections indicate their affiliation as independent, even though they are part of a coordinated effort. Whatever the motivation behind the initiative, and it is not my role to question it, The very large numbers of candidates has resulted in longer and more complicated ballots that present significant accessibility issues for Canadians. We have now reached the point where any further increase to the numbers of candidates will require me to reduce the font size of the names on the ballot, further compounding the accessibility challenges. Marking modified ballots takes longer and is more complex for all voters, resulting in decreased service times in voting locations. Finally, counting modified ballots takes significantly longer and delays the availability of provisional results. I have to date resorted to making adaptations to the Canada Elections Act as authorized by Section 17 of the Act to deviate from some of the prescriptions related to ballot format and the time at which the count of advance polls begins. These derogations have been necessary to accommodate an exceptionally large number of candidates, but do not provide a satisfactory solution for voters. Unless the Act is amended, I have no, and I repeat, I have no appropriate legal or administrative responses available to me. For this reason, I write to ask you to consider an amendment that could be brought before the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs during its study of Bill C-65, the Electoral Participation Act. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Stéphane Perreault, Chief Electoral Officer. So, after 2 by-elections, Toronto St. Paul and LaSalle-Lamar-Verdun, Election Canada said, we can't do this. We can't do this anymore. Yet it continued with the general election that happened on April 28th of this year. And now they want to make it even worse, ticking off and making it difficult for Canadians to actually cast their vote, making it difficult for Canadians to exercise their civic duty. And this is the problem. This is not the way to protest. And just because this one group says, well, we want this, well, that's great. That's great. You're making it difficult for everyone to actually exercise their civic duty, and you think it's a big joke, and you think it's funny. Well, democracy shouldn't be a joke. It shouldn't be a comedy affair, and it shouldn't be a way that you actually protest. It's not right. So later in the fall, after writing that letter, the Chief Electoral Officer actually went to committee and said, hello, this is an issue. You have to do something.
A second area that I would urge the committee to consider relates to ballot accessibility. As members are aware, there is a protest movement that has encouraged large numbers of candidates. And this started in the 44th general election, and we have seen it in 4 recent by-elections since then. And I have the ballots in here. In September by-election, LaSalle-Lamar-Verdun featured 91 candidates on 2 columns, and it's 1 meter in length. So you can imagine how difficult it is for an elector who has a disability or has some literacy issues or who cannot correctly handle a ballot of this size. So if the numbers go up, then we'll have to reduce the font size on the ballot, and this of course, will not help electors who have literacy problems or deficiency. So while I support the proposal in the bill to reduce the number of signatures required for nominations from 100 to 75, it is important to ensure that the requirement for supporting signatures is not turned on its head. In the case of the longest ballot initiative, we have seen nomination papers for various participating candidates signed by the same electors to a great extent. This indicates that voters who sign their nomination papers are not supporting the nomination of one particular candidate, but rather the idea of having as many candidates as possible, whomever they may be, consistent with the goals of the longest ballot initiative. So I wrote to Minister Leblanc in September asking the government to consider amendment to Bill C-65, which I've included in the table that I shared with the committee, to ensure that voters are limited to signing the nomination paper in support of only one candidate. It is essential, however, to guarantee that candidates should not have their nomination papers rejected or challenged simply because a person happens to have signed someone else's nomination paper, because candidates do not know who which other nomination paper someone may have signed. So we're not talking here about validity of the signature. Finally, it is necessary to consider the implications of legislative changes in the late stages of the electoral cycle, and in the current context of a minority government, full implementation of the bill will require updates to our documentation training, as well as updating numerous IT systems. These changes must be followed by thorough testing and simulations, and there must be adequate time to address any possible issues that arise before they can be used in an election.
So you don't get a sense of his tone, but he wasn't happy here. He was saying, look, this is the ridiculousness of this ballot, and if there's more, we're going to have to reduce the font size. Now, these ballots, they're not easy to see, as it is for people with eyesight issues. Case in point. But when you reduce them even more in order to actually just fit them on there, that's going to be a big problem. Big problem. But, the issue is so Bill C-65, that was the bill where the Liberals were actually trying to move the election date, if you recall. Now, Parliament was prorogued, and Parliament then ended up being dissolved, so Bill C-65, that's dust in the wind now. So those changes obviously didn't make it there. But those changes actually make sense. Those are the changes that the Liberals should have actually put in to actually get this bill across the table. I don't think any of the parties would have actually voted against that. So to recap, basically what he's suggesting is that when people are signing nomination papers for people to be allowed to run in an actual by-election or general election, they're saying they should only be allowed to sign them for one candidate. What the longest ballot committee has been alleged to have been doing, especially in the last general election, is they would get 100 signatures, which is the requirement, and then they would photocopy it and give it to every other candidate. That's what they've been accused of doing. So it is ridiculous that they're allowed to do this just for the sake of a protest. Now, in my opinion, they should be adding more things. I think they should be paying a refundable bond. I think they should need to do that because it can stop this type of behavior. And it makes sure that you're serious about running in a general election or a by-election. You're not just doing it as a freaking joke. So good on Elections Canada for trying to fight back against this, because 200 candidates on a ballot, it's a mockery of our system, and this is not the way to protest change. You should be starting a petition, rallying support, going to Parliament, talking with your MPs. That's how you are supposed to proceed and get change of this type of nature. Not, getting your buddies and get them all together and say, hey, let's put a whole bunch of us on a ballot, make it as difficult as possible for Canadians to actually vote, sit back, laugh, and then call that a protest.